Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
Here. I'm Ed O'Keefe of CBS. Thank you. I was recalling with some of the crew that one of the last times I was in this auditorium, I sat somewhere back there, and there was a guy named Tucker Carlson doing a TV show in here. So that was like 20 plus years ago when I was a college kid. And so it's quite surreal to be back doing this now, essentially doing what he was doing, but doing it better. Thank you for being here. The only thing we really ask is once they get going, just sit quietly, absorb, but don't necessarily react. There'll be time to applaud for them at the beginning of the debate and then at the end. But the real goal tonight is to do this in a way that we think conversations, arguments, debate should be done, which is to let the two principals or the principals involved have a conversation, have a debate amongst themselves. And so my hope is that they will engage each other, and my touch will be light and just sort of gently steer them in one way or another if need be. But if they do most of the talking, that's the idea. And if you see areas of agreement or areas of disagreement exposed through that, well, that's all the better, because that's essentially what we're hoping they can do, and get at least 2 of the 100 to have a civil and substantive conversation. So thank you for being here. Thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center, of course, to the Edward Kennedy Institute, the Orrin Hatch Foundation, to the crew who put this all together here at GW, and we'll hopefully have a good night. We'll see you in a little bit.
Orrin Hatch was the American dream personified. The scrappy son of a Pittsburgh metal lather, Orrin grew up during the Great Depression. Yet he overcame the poverty of his youth by working blue-collar jobs to put himself through college and law school. An accomplished boxer, Orrin brought that same fighting spirit with him to the courtroom and later to Congress. As a U.S. Senator, Orrin fought passionately for his principles, but he also had a penchant for bipartisanship. When the man known as the Gentleman of the Senate retired, he had passed more bills into law than anyone alive. Civility and solutions were his hallmarks, and they are the principles that guide our mission today. The Orrin G. Hatch Foundation seeks to build on Orrin's legacy of effective policymaking. Through our numerous publications, we tackle today's political challenges with ideas that transcend partisan lines. Our work has been highlighted time and again by national media, including the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Newsweek, and many others. The foundation is also home to the Orrin G. Hatch Papers, one of the largest collections of congressional history ever compiled. Making this library accessible to students is a key part of our mission to inspire the next generation of public leaders. To that end, we have helped establish student housing at the Orrin G. Hatch Center in Washington, D.C. But what truly sets us apart is our convening power. Hatch alumni comprise one of the most expansive professional networks in the country, and we leverage that network to provide a platform to industry and individuals alike. We bring together disparate voices from the public and private sectors to tell their stories and to find common ground. Whether it's through our publications, papers collections, or symposia, our goal is the same: to restore America's institutions to their proper place and function. This is how we're building on Orrin's legacy, and it's how we're securing a strong America for the next generation. Join us.
When hyperpolarization threatens the very future of our democracy and dialogue is anything but civil, the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate is working to become an important force in reestablishing civility in the Senate. This year, the Kennedy Institute launched the Senate Project, which brings U.S. senators together to model civil debate on a national stage. We are reintroducing the importance of seeking common ground and consensus that has been the essence of the Senate since it was conceived in 1789. And we are proud to demonstrate the possibilities of bipartisanship by partnering with the Orrin G. Hatch Foundation of Utah and the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C.
They fought like tigers, but they could work together.
Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch were indeed odd bedfellows who became prolific legislators together. The Kennedy Institute is building on the initial success of the Senate project by adding additional programs designed to encourage communication among those with polar opposite viewpoints. The Institute is also growing its existing award-winning programs in civics education designed to strengthen our system of democracy. Without young people understanding how our system works, the future strength of democracy is weakened. The Edward M. Kennedy Institute, helping to bring America together and protecting our culture of democracy when we need it most.
Please welcome the President and CEO of the Bipartisan Policy Center, Margaret Spellings.
Hey everybody, good evening and welcome to all. I'm Margaret Spellings, and let me begin by saying thank you. Thank you to all of you for joining us tonight, to our dedicated staff here at George Washington University, to our media partners, CBS News and Sirius XM, and our incredible production team. Thanks for helping the Bipartisan Policy Center sponsor this wonderful debate. It's the fourth in a series by the Senate Project. Tonight promises to be an interesting and informative discussion on some of the most critical issues facing our country and our world. We are honored that Senator Chris Coons and Senator Marco Rubio agreed to participate in this important program. Thanks to both of them. As you saw in those two videos, the genesis of the Senate project came from two U.S. senators who had very different points of view but looked for common ground. You'll be hearing from Senator Tom Daschle in just a moment with more on their relationship and what it meant for the Senate as an institution and for our country and all of us. I also had the privilege of collaborating with Senators Kennedy and Hatch during my time as Education Secretary during the George W. Bush administration. They set a standard for bipartisanship. There are a few people I'd like to recognize. After leaving the U.S. Senate earlier this year, the team at the Bipartisan Policy Center had the good sense to reach out to Senator Roy Blunt. During his time in Congress, he became a leader in looking for ways to work across the aisle. Senator Blunt is now an executive fellow at the BPC, and we are honored to have his expertise. Bruce Purcellay is the chairman of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate, joined by his executive director, Adam Hines. Matt Sandgren is the executive director of the Orrin G. Hatch Foundation. Matt spent 15 years as Senator Hatch's chief of staff. I also want to welcome Frank Fahrenkopf, the co-chair of the Commission on Presidential Debates. He knows a thing or two about debates, and we're pleased he could be with us. Thank you, Frank. This is my first day as president and CEO of the Bipartisan Policy Center. In addition to serving as a cabinet secretary, my career has taken me to the college campus as president of the University of North Carolina system, and until just a few weeks ago, president and CEO of Texas 2036, an organization addressing the most important issues for Texas in advance of its bicentennial. My new challenge is here as we expand the mission of the BPC. I'll be the first to admit that bipartisanship may not appeal to the most extreme voices in either party. We're all familiar with the noise in today's political climate, evident on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, on cable television, and on social media. And if we can get beyond all of that noise, there are lawmakers who can and do work together to accomplish big things. The only way to create lasting change is to have that debate, discuss the differences, and find common ground. So if you're starving for policymakers who will come together, then I ask you to join us collectively as we work to find solutions instead of sound bites. I'm looking forward to today's event and what will come next. Both Senator Coons and Senator Rubio have agreed to write a joint op-ed based on what comes out of their exchange this evening. We look forward to sharing that with you, and it will be posted on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org and, of course, on the Hatch and Kennedy websites. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the former Senate Democratic leader, Tom Daschle. He faced more than his fair share of political battles during his 2 decades in Congress. And after leaving the Senate, he collaborated with 3 other former party leaders, Senator Bob Dole, Senator Howard Baker, and Congressman George Mitchell, to create an organization that fosters fierce debate and common ground. We're here tonight in large part because of his vision and his tireless efforts to make our political process work just a little better. The BPC is one of his greatest achievements and a lasting legacy to Tom's distinguished career in public service. Please join me in welcoming Senator Daschle.
Thank you, Margaret, for that very kind introduction. And congratulations. I can't imagine a better way to launch your career with the BPC than an evening like tonight. Margaret and I had the chance to work together when she served as Secretary of Education with the George W. Bush administration. And I must say, served just in a remarkable way. So it's so good to have her back in Washington tonight. I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome her on her very first day here at the BPC and thank her for the leadership and the work that she has demonstrated over and over again in her public and private careers these many years. And Kelly, let me thank you for your leadership this past year at the helm of the BPC. It's not easy, and you've done it well. It was a little over 3 years ago when I commented to my fellow board members at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute that at times I didn't recognize the Senate the way it was operating today. Often called the world's greatest deliberative body, today polarization is generating our politics and media in an impactful way that oftentimes is repulsive. And that is why I'm so pleased tonight to see 3 great organizations working collectively on a single goal: to create a forum in which we can watch the passionate debate that we expect in the Senate, a hallmark of our democracy, and then, when possible, look for areas of common ground. Tonight we have 2 people I've admired a great deal, 2 distinguished lawmakers who represent 2 different parties and oftentimes 2 different points of view. But like each of us, they're Americans first. Senator Coons and Senator Rubio will debate some of the leading issues facing our country, including threats from our foreign adversaries, climate change facing the planet. And just like our founders, who argued, who discussed, and disagreed, they're going to look for areas of common ground as well. Yesterday, as some of you may recall, we marked the anniversary of our Constitution. And I'm often reminded of that scene on the final day of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. It's a story that I'm absolutely certain most of you have already heard. But on this, the day after the anniversary of the Constitution, I think it bears repeating. As you recall, residents in Philadelphia gathered on the steps of Independence Hall to await the news of government from our founders and what they'd crafted. One of them asked the oldest founding father, Benjamin Franklin, who stood at the steps as they were walking out, "Mr. Franklin, what do we have? A monarchy or a republic?" Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." And that's our responsibility now nearly 250 years later. Can we keep it? After all we've gone through these past years, those words actually ring louder than ever. Tonight, we're going to have a chance to hear those differences, but in a forum that gives two U.S. senators the space to share their points of view, and yes, at times, agree to disagree, but with a level of mutual respect. I had the great privilege to work side by side with Ted and Orrin. They were not only colleagues, but they became very close friends. We traveled together. We actually hung out on weekends together. Ted and Orrin were of two different parties, two different ideologies, from opposite ends of the country. But despite those differences, they really respected each other's point of view. They didn't agree on everything, but in areas where there was agreement, they went all in to get things done to make this country a better place. They believed, as I so strongly believe, that compromise is the oxygen of democracy. As a result, their names are on some of the most important pieces of legislation from the 20th and 21st century, from the Americans with Disabilities Act to the Ryan Care Act for AIDS, to the Children's Health Insurance Program known as CHIPS, and of course, Secretary Spellings knows so well, major education reform with no child left behind. Consider that for just a moment, and the impact that each of these bipartisan bills continue tonight to have on the country. We need a lot more like them in Congress if we want to tackle the big issues facing our country now. I only wish they could be here tonight. They'd be so proud of the work that these three highly respected institutions are doing to carry on their legacy. To the BPC, to the EMK Institute, to the Hatch Foundation, thank you for bringing us together tonight, and for all the work that you do to ensure that we can find that common ground. And in the bipartisan spirit of the evening, I'm pleased to welcome one of the newest members of the Senate Alum Society, the former Republican senator from Missouri and now an executive fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, my friend, and truly my friend, Roy Blunt.
Thank you, Tom. Tom is a good friend. Actually, our accomplished wives are really good friends, which makes it easier for us to be really good friends, but we have been. And Tom's certainly been a great advisor of mine after I announced a couple of years ago I wasn't going to run for another term. You know, the United States Senate is probably the only place, one of the few places at least in the world, where at my age, after 26 years in the Congress, people would ask you why you were leaving so early. But I had a lot of good advice from Tom as I did that. I want to join him certainly in welcoming Margaret. What a big first day. Not everybody has a first day like this, and I'm sure it's going to be one of a lot of great days. And thanks to Kelly, who really provided a lot of leadership during the year that took to convince Margaret she should do this job and for her to get here. I'm glad to be an executive fellow, one of the two executive fellows at the Bipartisan Policy Center with my friend Val Demings from Florida. We've found new ways to work together. We had an op-ed published not too long ago, and I was glad to be part of that. As Margaret pointed out, one of the reasons we're here is Tom Daschle's determined leadership that you have to find solutions. Now, I'd point out that the Bipartisan Policy Center is not nonpartisan. It's bipartisan, and that's different. When Tom Daschle and I first had a chance to work together, I was the Republican whip in the House, and he was the Democratic leader in the Senate. Those are clearly not nonpartisan jobs. But I think we both felt then and still feel that the best solutions are found in the middle. They last the longest, they have the most resilience, they serve us the best. You know, a couple of Congresses ago, there were 52 Republicans in that Senate and 48 Democrats, and my staff came to me one day and said, you do so many things with other members to find one thing you can agree on. We thought we'd just check and see how many of the 48 Democrats you'd been the principal sponsor of a bill with, not just a co-sponsor, but the principal sponsor. And the answer was 44. I thought that was a pretty good answer. In my last speech on the Senate floor, I said, to get something done here, you don't have to find somebody that you agree on everything with. You just have to find somebody you agree on one thing with, and that leads to getting things done. Senator Rubio, Senator Coons, and I all came to the Senate at the same time, and we worked on lots of things together. Senator Coons and I worked on the Victims of Child Abuse Act every time it needed to be extended, and AmeriCorps every time it needed to be extended. Senator Rubio and I were set side by side on the Senate Intelligence Committee for several of the years that we served there, and everything from dealing with those intel issues to daylight savings time, full-time extension, which we are both for, and almost everybody in this room will be for in about 6 weeks or so, wondering why we didn't get that done, even though I will point there was one day when our daylight savings bill passed unanimously in the Senate, though I've never been quite sure how many senators were there the day it passed unanimously. We're here for an Oxford-style debate where two people stand on the stage and exchange ideas about issues we have to find a solution to. Lucky to have Ed O'Keefe from CBS News here as the person to see that this debate answers some of those questions. Also lucky tonight to welcome Nadia Lishki to come and sing the national anthem, and I'd like for all of you to stand as she comes to do that.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last streaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red clear, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Please welcome tonight's moderator, CBS News senior White House and political correspondent, Ed O'Keefe.
All right. Well, good evening. I'm Ed O'Keefe, senior White House and political correspondent for CBS News. Welcome to the Senate Project debate taking place here on the campus of George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Now, to those of you watching on CBS News or through SiriusXM, thank you for tuning in. This is a partnership between the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate, the Orrin G. Hatch Foundation, and the Bipartisan Policy Center. These organizations join together to create a forum in which elected officials can discuss some of the most important issues of our time, while also looking for areas of common ground. Delaware Democratic Senator Chris Coons, let's do that again, Delaware Democratic Senator Chris Coons and Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio have agreed to join us on this stage, and the rules are simple. Senator Rubio selected the topics of China and U.S. global leadership. Senator Coons chose energy and the environment. And the third topic will focus on the U.S. Senate as an institution and the state of our politics today. Each senator will present opening arguments, followed by rebuttals. My job is to give them the time and space to have that debate and leave it to them primarily to have that conversation. The audience behind me has assured me, they're going to remain quiet for the next hour, except right now, as we welcome Senators Coons and Rubio to the stage. We were getting such a Hollywood opening. But thank you, gentlemen, senators, for being here. As we said, Senator Rubio opted to go with the issue of China and U.S. global policy. So, Senator Rubio, first with your opening argument, and then we'll hear from Senator Coons.
Well, thank you. It's really an honor to be here. I've done a lot of debates over the last few years, but usually with like 10 other people on stage calling each other names. So this should be interesting and productive. Look, I picked the topic of China. It's not really about China. It's about us. I think if you, 80 years from now, 70 years from now, someone will write books about the 21st century. And most of us in this room, for the most part, may not be around then. What will that be about? There'll be a couple chapters maybe about Vladimir Putin in there. There'll certainly be other things that are covered. But that book, The Story of the 21st Century, is going to be about what happened between the United States and China. What happened? Did one overcome the other? Did one become predominant in the case of China? Were they able to find a coexistence and a balance to their relationship? Whatever the outcome is, I think will determine and define the 21st century. And I think we've made some very bad mistakes over the last 30 years. And I say we because neither of us were in the Senate at the time, but I think policymakers, we did have a bipartisan consensus in this country. And the bipartisan consensus was this. The Cold War was over. The free world had won. We could now, it didn't matter anymore where the market sent jobs because all these jobs would leave, but don't worry, better jobs will replace them and they'll pay you more. And once China got rich and China got prosperous, even if they cheated their way there, they would become just like us. That sounds silly when I say it now, but that was the bipartisan consensus, and it benefited. Certainly benefited Wall Street, it benefited Silicon Valley, it benefited the Chamber of Commerce and other industries, and frankly, it influenced our public policy, and it was a terrible mistake. In fact, it does matter. Nationhood matters. It does matter. The ability to make things matter. It did matter that those jobs were leaving. They were not replaced by better paying jobs for the people who lost them, maybe for others. And the result is not just having an impact on America. It's having an impact on every single Western industrialized country on the planet. Everyone is going through an upheaval because of this. And at the core of it is China. And make no mistake, China is an expansionist power. An expansionist power. Just think about over the last 100 years, as the West has decolonized, basically walked away from colonization, they have annexed Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia and Tibet. They took over Hong Kong. They've taken over portions of northern India. They claim the entire South China Sea. They make it very clear that they intend to take over Taiwan one day. This is an expansionist power. They also economically cheat. They steal $600 billion a year of intellectual property. Their companies can do whatever they want in America, but our companies can't do whatever we want over there. Capitalism did not change China. China changed capitalism. It's used it against us as a weapon. And they empowered, and they enabled, and they deputized hundreds and hundreds of industries and their lobbyists in Washington to influence American foreign policy and American domestic policy. And we're running out of time to reverse it. It's an extraordinary, historic challenge and one we need to confront with open eyes and truly understand that they do not view this as a win-win situation. From their point of view, the last 100 years are an aberration, and it is their rightful place to be the world's most powerful country. And I, for one, do not want my children or my grandchildren that are yet to be conceived, much less born, at least last I checked. I, for one, do not want them to inherit a world where the most powerful nation on the earth is a fascist police state that condemns Uyghur Muslims to work camps, that oppresses its people, and that empowers that sort of authoritarianism all over the world. So I think it's an extraordinary challenge, and one that I hope we can build a new consensus on to replace the old and flawed one.
Senator Coons.
Well, thank you, Ed. Thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center. Congratulations, Margaret, to our friends, Senators Daschle and Blunt, to the Kennedy Institute, the Hatch Foundation, GW, my wife Annie, family and friends for being here tonight, to Senator Rubio. Marco, thank you for agreeing to this evening's discussion. To look back at how our time in the Senate started together, we literally introduced a bill called the AGREE Act in 2011, which was 5 different ideas that we wove together to try and challenge our parties, which at that time were already showing signs of fraying, to move forward together. One of the pieces of that AGREE Act that we introduced in 2011 had to do with protecting our inventions and our innovations from Chinese predation. I largely agree with Senator Rubio that China is the leading challenge to the American way of life, to our security, to our inventions and innovations, to testing our global standing. They have engaged in debt trap diplomacy through the Belt and Road Initiative. They are threatening our supply chains and our access to everything from pharmaceuticals to semiconductor chips. As I came into the Senate, I was leaving 8 years in a manufacturing company, and I knew all too well how Chinese theft of our inventions, our trade secrets, was a critical challenge. And so one of the very first bills I got involved with was teaming up with then Senator Orrin to pass into law the Defend Trade Secrets Act. It was based on an experience I had in the private sector where someone we thought was a trusted partner in research was in fact a PLA agent who ran out the door with a laptop full of some of our most important inventions. At the time, the law didn't allow a private sector company to take private action to recover that set of trade secrets. Now it does. As the chair of the Africa Subcommittee in my first 2 Congresses with my dear friend Johnny Isakson, Republican Senator of Georgia, I could see how Chinese offerings of investment in infrastructure were tempting African developing nations, and we weren't offering a competitive alternative. So I worked hard with then Senator Bob Corker to pass the BUILD Act, to help create the Development Finance Corporation, to provide an alternative that was more transparent, more sustainable, met our values and our priorities. And I'm working hard on the Appropriations Committee to provide the resources the DFC needs to be something that can meet the moment of that challenge. And last, in terms of the issues, the threats to semiconductors and our supply chains, the real risk posed to Taiwan, not just the risk to their independence and freedom, but also the risk to our defense and our system, I worked with senators of both parties to help shape and pass the CHIPS and Science Act in the last Congress. I think it's critical to show that we can solve problems. China is an absolutely critical threat. And I'll close with this. The most important thing we can do is to strengthen our democracy by showing that we have answers to the challenges of this century. That's part of why I'm excited to be on this stage with you tonight, Marco, is to show that we can find common ground together.
You're free to rebut, or...
Well, it was a very nice statement. I don't know how to rebut that, but
much to disagree with
well,
there, I know.
And I think we probably agree on this, too. First of all, let me just say this issue of China is that there actually is a developing consensus in the country that this needs to be confronted, even in Congress. I would say that the divisions on this issue aren't necessarily always partisan. They generally fall and die in this way. If you are in an industry or in a business that's done quite well with your investments in China, you're going to come up with all kinds of very creative reasons why we shouldn't go too far in pushing them, okay? And so that doesn't always fall along neat partisan lines, and in many cases, some of the real challenges we have faced have been in my own party with regards to some of these issues, because there were many that would basically say we should trust the market. And listen, I hate socialism. I think it's a failure. This country is facing a migratory crisis because socialism out of Venezuela, out of Cuba, out of Nicaragua has driven much of that. But I think the fundamental challenge we have to face now is, okay, the market will always find the most efficient outcome, which is generally the right outcome. But what do you do when the most efficient outcome is not in the national interest? Because it is more efficient to depend on them for 88% of the active ingredients in our pharmaceuticals. It's cheaper. it's not in our national interest to depend on China for 88% of the active ingredients in our pharmaceuticals. And we can go down the list industry after industry. So that desire to confront it, I think, is a new consensus. I think what's going to be our challenge is that this is not an issue that lends itself to incrementalism or half measures, because the challenge is extraordinary. This is by far the single greatest near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They are much more powerful than the Soviet Union ever was. The Soviet Union was a military and geopolitical competitor. They were never an industrial or technological one. And I do think that our concern needs to be matched by a level of urgency in both political parties. And it's not enough to just say, we're going to pass a bill that says really nasty things about China. That's stupid. That's tactical. We have to have a strategic point of view in regards to how serious this threat is and take measures that actually make sense and that respond to how serious a threat this is with serious proposals. And really, we can only do it if there's a bipartisan consensus around it and not half measures. And again, hopefully we'll be able to arrive at that point in our country where there's that level of urgency to get something done.
Let me ask you both. President Biden was asked to characterize the U.S.-China relationship during his recent visit to Vietnam. He said in part, quote, "I think we think too much in Cold War terms." He later added the relationship instead should be about, quote, "generating economic growth and stability in all parts of the world." Is that the right approach to China?
Well, I don't think this is anything like the Cold War. I actually have never used that terminology. The Cold War was scarier but easier to understand. And they wanted to spread Marxism all over the world. The Chinese don't care if you become a Marxist or not. They just want you to owe them a bunch of money. They want you to owe them as much money as your economy's worth. Then they can get you to do anything they want at the United Nations. They seek to replace every institution created after the Second World War that the U.S. has led in on a global scale. They have a replacement for each one of them. They seek to challenge, they seek to become the dominant military power in the Indo-Pacific region, but they want to also be able to project power all over the world. They seek to dominate all of the industries that are going to be key to the 21st century. They even published, they don't talk about this plan anymore, by the way, but it's called Made in China 2025. They literally put out a blueprint. We are going to dominate these 10 industries, and some of them were like things like heavy machinery, and not just some of the high-tech stuff. And so I think we have to view it in that way. The Chinese would like to, and I say the Communist Party of China, would like to avoid frontal confrontation as long as the United States as long as possible, because they believe that the longer they can extend this, the longer they can continue their rise without some conflict setting them back. But we should be under no illusions. That they do not have a win-win mentality of the world, and we should also be under no illusions about this. We're here tonight to talk about areas of agreement and consensus. That's not a tradition in their political culture. It's not, and it's not going to translate to their foreign policy.
Senator Coons, is it a Cold War or is it something else?
It is something else, but I'll reference 2 or 3 ways in which it seems eerily reminiscent. We are in a contest of wills with a different system. The Chinese Communist Party, which under Xi Jinping's leadership has taken a sharp turn to control and repress its people, to be more active and engaged in what was the independent private sector formerly in China. And, as Senator Rubio has said, is significantly more expansionist, regionally and globally. In that way, this is somewhat similar to our contest with the Soviet Union, a contest of 2 very different systems with different understandings of individual rights and liberty, and where our greatest strength is our global network of alliances. Our alliances were critical to our success in the Cold War, and I would argue our alliances with countries with common values that are free market societies, open societies with robust media that respect the rights of individuals and with free and fair elections. That's the world we now need to embrace and lead, and I would argue we are. When Xi Jinping and his emissaries go around the world, and I've heard this and seen this in dozens of countries I've visited in the last decade, they say we are a declining power. They say the United States is inevitably headed downward and they are inevitably ascendant. We can prove them wrong, but doing so begins by strengthening our own internal capability to show that democracy delivers and by embracing our global network of allies.
So we both agree China's bad, we're not in a Cold War.
Well, there's one point where I would put a different frame. Are we allowed in the rules here?
Yeah, go
Because
ahead.
I'm used to like some news person screaming at me. That's not the rules
No,
here.
no, no.
Okay,
the rules here are...
So I actually think the world is going to look different than the one that Senator Coons just described during the Cold War, where it was the free war. And it actually had some elements of this as well. I think there's clearly a block of nations coming together to form, probably not something as like a formal military alliance, but certainly some sort of a global cooperative between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others. The coalition of the sanctioned, I guess is the right term. And then obviously nations that have respect for the things we've discussed, or that have common interest in us in preserving things like freedom, democracy, liberty, respect for individual liberty. A concept, again, foreign to the Chinese Communist Party. They do not have any concept of individual liberty as we would define it. And then there's a third group, and that's emerging countries. And you know what they're doing? They're doing what you would do if you were an emerging country. I'm going to cut the best deal I can with both sides. Can I get military equipment from the U.S. and cheap Huawei systems that are actually very effective in my country? Can I get China to pay for my new port and the United States to give me some money for whatever? They're going to try to leverage both sides, and I think we have to be very mature and very strategic about how we approach that in many of these cases. You go to Senator Coons actually is an expert on Africa issues. And many of those countries will openly say they don't want to be forced to pick a side in this thing. They want the benefits of both. So I think that existed somewhat in the Cold War, but I think it's going to be really pronounced in this new era. You see the outlines of it already.
I want to ask you both a Senate question related to China. The Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, is said to be preparing to organize some kind of a bipartisan trip to China.
Yes.
Is that a good idea?
Yes. Look, many senators have never been to China. Many senators have a view and an understanding of the PRC that's simply informed by what they've read or seen on television. And like many places I've been in the world, I think you can't grasp what China is today, what it's capable of, its scope and its ambitions without spending time there. I first went to China decades ago. I most recently went there leading a CODEL and was stunned at just how much of a difference there is. In their development, in their technology, and in the directness with which they're willing to just sit down and lay out that they are intending to meet us and in some places replace us. And that is a challenge, that they have an ambition on the world stage. We are capable of having collaboration and cooperation, and we have to consider that on critical areas, whether it's nuclear proliferation, counterterrorism, managing pandemics, dealing with climate change. There's a very mixed record across those four. There's also areas where we have to be clear-eyed about their competition with us for those non-aligned countries, and how we, to understand their engagement, need to meet with them and hear from them. But frankly also, if you haven't seen China on the ground in the last decade, or if you've never been there at all, I think it's hard to grasp. To go to Taiwan and to go to the PRC, and to see in a Chinese context a robust democracy and an open market economy, and a country controlled by the CCP, is to be informed about the challenges ahead.
Senator Rubio?
Well, I'm banned and sanctioned by China, so I will not be on that trip. And
I thought you were going to say you were banned by Senator Schumer.
No. It's one of those trips where if 10 people go on one of them, only 9 may come back, and the other one's going to be on YouTube condemning his country, So I would tell you that my only concern about, I generally, whatever, you want to go meet with these leaders and talk to them, but my only concern about it is the way it would be perceived. Perception is real. And the perception and the mindset that, look, the way the world views America right now, unfortunately, and forget about who's president, who was president, who's going to be president, just in general about our cultures, we cannot sustain. Our attention span is we'll talk about something for 3 months, that's our long-term planning, and then we'll move on to something else. And in the end, their viewpoint is, no matter how much these politicians talk tough, they like buying stuff from Shein. Is that what it's called, Shein? The place I've never ordered from in my life. But I heard it's cheap. And they are so addicted to what we can provide them that in the end, they're really limited in what they can do. And my fear is that they'll perceive these leadership trips as an indicator of us looking for an exit strategy and accommodation in that front. In the end, if they want to go, I hope that the message they take and deliver is a strong one. And I'll be watching here from the United States because I can't go anyway. So,
both of you also agreed to take on the broader topic of U.S. global leadership, which you were just alluding to, Senator. So it's an issue you both, of course, confront every day as members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So let's spend a few minutes on that topic. Senator Rubio, it was yours, so please go ahead.
Well, I think U.S. global leadership is important. I think it needs to be adjusted to the times in which we live. So I'll give you a perfect example. This is really simplistic, but I think we should be a country that if you are friendly and aligned with the United States, we should be really good to you and supportive. I think if you're an adversary of the United States, we should be firm with, even as we may have to engage on an issue from time to time. That's not the message you get. I'll tell you frankly, what I get from leaders in Latin America is they start to wonder, is it better to be mean to America? Is it better to be crossways with America? Because they seem to spend more time and attention on you than they would otherwise. I think the other thing that has to come into play is the national interest. And this is a tough thing for us to accept because this was once a unipolar world. We were the only country in the world that could project power everywhere. And that's no longer the case, not because America's gotten smaller, but because the world has gotten more complex. And I think we should care about all the horrible things that are happening on the planet, but I think we have to prioritize the ones that have the direct impact on our national interest. Our national interest has to be at the forefront of where we allocate resources and spend our attention on, and how we make these decisions. And some nations and some places and some crises have a greater impact on our national interest. And I don't think we should ever feel guilty about putting our national interest. This is not to mean we want to act counter to the national interest of other nations by design, but sometimes they will be in conflict, and what matters to the U.S. is important. And I'll put it to you this way. If United States leaders do not put the national interest of the United States first, what leaders in the world will? That's our number one obligation. And so I think that's the part where our global engagement needs to be tailored, perhaps more than it was even 5 or 10 years ago.
Are we a reliable ally and partner? That is a key question currently being asked around the world. So when I think about our place in the world, I think about the questions I've been asked by foreign ministers, defense ministers, opposition leaders, heads of state in dozens of countries in recent years. We just adopted an amendment to the Defense Authorization Act that I think Senators Kaine and Rubio led, that no president can unilaterally withdraw us from our most important and enduring alliance, NATO. There's a reason for that. Whether it's strengthening our partnerships in the Indo-Pacific through AUKUS or pulling together Japan and South Korea, or it's by investing in the expansion of NATO, this is a moment in our role in the world where our national interest is to be a strong and reliable ally. One of the reasons many of us are fighting hard for more resources for the Ukrainians who are fighting so bravely to expel the Russian invaders and occupiers from their land is because we've committed to this fight. There are 47 other countries contributing collectively as much, if not more, than we have, and this sends a signal around the world. If we flag in our enthusiasm, to the point Senator Rubio made about concerns about our attention span, not just individually, but collectively, if we flag in our enthusiasm and our support for the fight of Ukraine, it sends clear signals, I think, to others in the world who would also seek to change boundaries and to invade or occupy or undermine countries by force.
You know, you're both on the Foreign Relations Committee. Last I checked, you're both also on appropriations.
Yes.
Ukraine, as you mentioned, is seeking even more assistance. President Zelensky will be here this week. Give us a sense of where that's headed. Are they going to get the money? How much? Is the push to have strings attached or better accountability for how it's spent real?
I'll say that they are doing a great job at accountability and transparency back with us. The last time I was in Kyiv was with Senator Portman last year, and one of several things we did, in addition to meeting with human rights advocates, with those who are prosecuting and investigating Russian war crimes, was to meet with the team that was following, tracking, tracing where our funds and our resources and our equipment's going. It is an active war, so one has to be a little patient about every single piece of equipment, but overall, I think we've got a very strong system of accountability. Both Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell, both of our caucus leaders, and many of the chairs and ranking of the relevant key committees have spoken up, both privately and publicly, about the importance of this funding because of what it sends as a signal. Putin's strategy is to wait us out. It's the strategy he followed in Chechnya. It's the strategy he followed in Syria. It is a brutal, aggressive, World War I style, a war of attrition. We cannot let him win. Putin will only stop in Ukraine if we all collectively stop him. So I think this funding is critical.
Well, and I generally agree with that. I'd say three things that are important on this, though. The first is, do we have a national interest in what's happening in Ukraine? I believe we do. Not an unlimited national interest, but an important one. So at this point especially, if the United States tomorrow announced we're not doing anything more with Ukraine, we're gone, the impact wouldn't just be felt in Ukraine. Every our entire alliance system would be put into doubt. I mean, if you're Japan, if you're South Korea, if you're Taiwan, if you're anybody, you start to say that's America doing what we thought and feared they might do and what we've been told by their adversaries that they will do. Number two is China's on Russia's side, so that right away tells you which side we should be on. I want Putin to lose this engagement. So I think there is a national interest. The second then is, what are we supporting? What is the strategy? Is the goal? And I think here's where the difficult part is, because the Ukrainian view of it, at least as it appears, is they seek to retake all of the territories that rightfully belong to them, including Crimea, or are we helping them recapture where they were before February of 2022? I think that's a really important answer that we need from this administration. What is it that we're putting it towards? And then the third is, how much can we afford to do? And here's where the real challenge comes in. We do not have unlimited stockpiles. We don't send, people think we're giving them money, but primarily what we're providing is weapons systems. So we give them a system, okay, off our shelves. We now have to replace it. And we have to have enough of those to fund our own defense needs. And these aren't necessarily things you can just order on Amazon and they get delivered in 2 weeks. Or it takes longer for me because I'm sanctioned by China. But in other places, you can't just order these things and they come online. They take time. We don't even have the industrial capacity in some cases to make them. And so I think we're very cautious that in this endeavor that we are not depleting our own stockpiles in a way that is diverting from what I believe is potentially one of the most catastrophic things we may see before the end of this decade, and that is a temptation to the Chinese military to move militarily against Taiwan, a direct test against not just the assurances we've made in that region, but I think in ways that could redefine the global order permanently if we fail or are not prepared to meet that challenge, or to deter it, even more importantly. So my view of it is, yes, we have a national interest, but if on a scale of 1 to 10, let's say it's a 5, then our contribution towards it should be commensurate to that national interest. It is not an unlimited national interest, and it is also not one that's immune from public opinion, where increasingly Americans are asking, I have these problems, I have that problem, we face this other problem here domestically. We can find billions for that, but nothing for this. And I think that's a real challenge that we face, and it gets harder every month and over the last year and a half.
Where would you put limits on the national interest?
Well, I think the national interest we have most certainly is to ensure that Russia is not successful at their initial aims, which is what Putin thought was going to happen is he would invade, Zelensky would take off, and he would be greeted as they would be greeted as liberators. And he believed that because his own intelligence people were probably telling them that, because in authoritarian regimes, people don't tell the people on up what they need to hear. They tell them what they want to hear. That's how you get promoted. And it didn't work out that way. We have to ensure that he's never successful at that. Anything beyond that is, I think, something Congress really needs to debate. I have real questions about, not because I don't want them to retake Crimea or these other territories, but whether that is, I mean, that certainly wasn't America's posture on February of 2022 before the invasion. And so I think there really needs to be a strategic view of this that guides what we give them and how much we are able to spend.
How far should we be willing to go with them?
As far as it takes. No less a conservative than Jim Risch, the ranking member of Foreign Relations, has over and over reminded us that in 1994, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal on Earth. And a group of countries, then Russia, UK, US, sat them down and persuaded them to give up their nuclear arms. The Budapest Memorandum, signed by those countries, was a commitment to protect their territorial integrity. Jim's a lawyer, we're lawyers. He tends to wave this one around and say, we made a commitment, first. Second, our president has said, as long as it takes. Third, we have expanded NATO. NATO now has new members who are incredibly capable, and I think that means that strategically, Putin has already failed. But let's take a moment and look at why Prigozhin, why the Wagner Group marched on Moscow. Out of frustration with their failure to achieve their aims, and out of frustration at the corruption and the ineptitude of the Russian military. Who is Putin meeting with? Kim Jong-un. Why? To get resupply for his artillery. When he's got to go to North Korea to get artillery shells for his war in the east and south of Ukraine, we are making progress. So it is hard to say that on a 1 to 10, I'd put this at an 8 or 9, but I would, because I think the signal it sends, we are more likely to see a resolution to this war when Putin concludes he can't wait us out and that we are determined. It seems contradictory to say we need to be committed as long as it will take, but when we are, I think it will actually take less long for Putin to conclude he cannot win.
I want to ask you both, before we move on, also about the news today of the prisoner swap between the United States and Iran, especially in the context of global leadership. If the United States continues to engage adversaries in this way, what does that do to U.S. global leadership?
These are tough issues because you're never unhappy with an American and an American citizen is unjustly detained and then freed. You're never unhappy that they're coming back home. But I think this is one of the difficult things about it. You've paid money for it. And we also gave concessions, for example, in Venezuela, where we made a deal with them in exchange for Americans, and we released convicted narco-terrorists, narco-traffickers, convicted in federal court. We sent them back, happened to be nephews of the dictator there. And so here's the problem with it. It's not just a sign of weakness. You've now put a price tag on the head of Americans. Now you have rogue elements all over the world, from Haiti to Iran to Venezuela, anywhere else in the world, saying, if we find an American and we can arrest them, especially if it's something that we think could, let's take them, because we'll be able to get something in exchange for them. And so I think that is where the difficulty lies here in making these deals. I also think that the context of that, in addition to cash that was freed up, that was frozen, the context of it, it was probably part of the broader effort to try to revive the Iran deal, which I think is unrevivable at this point. It would be a bad idea to revive. But that's my biggest problem with it. It's not that the Americans are coming home. Is that now elements all over the world realize we can get something in exchange for Americans. Let's take some.
Senator Coons?
This is what's painful about meeting with the families of Americans held in prisons or unjustly overseas, which I've done many times. Senator Rubio and I are actually co-sponsoring a bill to create a National Hostage Day and a flag to remember those who are being unjustly detained around the world, whether in Venezuela or Russia or Iran. To be clear, in two small but important points, these are Iranian frozen assets that are being released for humanitarian purposes, not money going from U.S. taxpayers to the Iranian regime. But I understand those who are concerned about the signal it sends as we continue to negotiate to try and bring Americans home. Having sat with the families of several of those who are now on their way home, more than anything, I celebrate with them the return of Americans.
It's about $6 billion. The United States at least says there will be guardrails placed on that money to ensure that it's only used for humanitarian purposes. There are some members of your party who've expressed skepticism about those guardrails. You confident they'll hold up?
I'm optimistic they'll hold up.
Are you?
It is an understandable concern.
The Iranian humanitarian regimes, the regime's humanitarian programs do not have a good track record. What does have a good track record is their innovation on UAVs that are armed, one-way UAV attacks. They're increasing all the capacities that they've now been able to carry out in terms of their missile systems, their long-range missile systems, their sponsorship of Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations around the world. They are interested in all. This is where they put their money. That's why those assets were frozen in the first place, is so that they wouldn't be able to dedicate it to those things. And as their own leaders have said on television and in global broadcasts, that money will be spent however they think it needs to be spent. They've been pretty clear about it. So I think it's, frankly, I think we can be hopeful that it's going to go to humanitarian, but I don't think we should be counting on it. In fact, I think we should be expecting that money will be used to do what Iran has been spending money on for the last 2 decades, and that is the sponsorship of terrorism and increasing their military capabilities.
You're vice chairman of the Intelligence Committee. I imagine you guys would be able to figure out, by way of the intelligence agencies, if the money's being spent the wrong way?
Well, I think you would see the end product of, they just have a lot more UAVs, they have a lot more long-range missiles, Hezbollah suddenly has more money. They'll try to hide it, they'll try to in some ways, but they deny that they're behind those things now. At the end of the day, the expansions that they've carried out, even with the sanctions in place, have been pretty substantial. I mean, their capabilities today and what they've supplied others with in that region is pretty substantial as it is. Imagine with another $6 billion on the way. So I just think we're not dealing with humanitarians. We're dealing with a regime that views acquisition of these weapons as not just a way of survival, but to achieve their aims of Shia dominance in the region.
All right. Well, we've gone. Go ahead.
Let's just be mindful that at the end of the day, the pariah regime that is driving greater and greater risk is Russia, which is sitting with the Iranians, sitting with the North Koreans and saying, we need more. We need more drones, we need more missiles, we need more artillery. And what concerns me, among many other things we ought to be concerned about, is what technology, what capabilities, what secrets the Russians are going to give in exchange for those. This is a really critical moment, and I think one of the core arguments why strengthening our pressure, our collective global pressure on Russia for its conduct in Ukraine and for its partnership with these other pariah regimes is a critical piece of our place in the world and our strategy going forward.
We've found some agreement as we traverse the world there. That's a good sign. We're going to move on now to the second topic of the evening chosen by Senator Coons regarding climate, energy, and the environment. Senator Coons, go ahead.
Well, I think if the U.S.-China relationship, our challenge, our contest, is the defining issue for U.S. national security, then climate change is the defining issue for our world. We are from two states that are among the lowest lying in the whole country and actually the most vulnerable to sea level rise. I'm seeing more and more what I'd call weather weirdness, not just global warming, but tornadoes in times and places we've never seen them, wildfires devastating whole communities, and hurricanes pummeling states all over, but in particular Florida. In response to this, something that is a challenge all of us face, I started the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, which has 14 of us, including Senator Rubio, 7 and 7. In fact, this week we have a meeting with critical minerals industry leaders to talk about the path forward in a clean energy transition. Again, as was the case in confronting the challenge of China, I think I have a strong record over a decade of legislating in this area, of working with Senator Collins on green chemistry, on carbon dioxide transport with Senator Cassidy, hydrogen initiatives, 4 bills with Senator Cornyn, the nuclear workforce. I support nuclear energy as a part of our energy security and our path forward. And now with Kevin Cramer, Senator from North Dakota, the Prove It Act to begin to get the emissions intensity measured so that we can harmonize with the EU and begin to move the Chinese economy through common action. One of the biggest things accomplished in the last Congress was something where we might disagree. The Inflation Reduction Act put $369 billion of incentives into the American economy. It is restoring American manufacturing. There are now groundbreakings on battery and car plants in Texas and Georgia and Ohio. And frankly, at the end of the day, I think it shows a sharp contrast between how the United States is responding to the challenge of climate and how Europe is. Europe predominantly through regulation, the United States through incentives. I grew up in a manufacturing family. I spent time in a manufacturing business before I came to the Senate, and I think nothing strengthens our society more than restoring being a country that builds things. We need energy security for manufacturing to be successful in this country, but we also have to confront that the world is transitioning to a cleaner energy economy. We have a lot of hard work to do together, and it's my hope that as a fellow member of this Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, Senator Rubio will be one of my legislative partners I'll be citing next year.
How's that for a sales pitch? Go ahead.
Well, it depends. I would say I'm all for dealing with mitigating the fact that the sea level rise is immeasurable. You can measure. Here's where the sea level was at. Here's where it is today. Here's the impact that it has. I have nothing against the renewables. I have nothing against electric cars. I have nothing against, you want to make windmills, go ahead and build these windmills. You want to rely on solar. My big problem there is we gave it to the Chinese. They now dominate that industry. Even though we innovated it, they now control it. And we increasingly have to rely on that, not just for that, but for the batteries for these cars. But here's the challenge, okay? Energy, when we talk about the energy part, this is not dealing with that at any cost, because abundant and affordable energy is at the core of everything. Prosperity, global prosperity, our own prosperity, the ability of an economy to grow, the ability to do anything you do. Manufacturing, you need abundant and affordable and reliable energy sources. And I'm not accusing the senator of saying this, because he's actually, I think, approached this from a standpoint of trying to find solutions that unify people on it. But I do think there's some out there that at least they're selling this mythology that somehow renewables can replace hydrocarbons and nuclear and hydroelectric energy. It cannot. Not any time in the foreseeable future. And if you think about the world today, okay, if everybody else on this planet consumed just 50% of the energy that we Americans consume, and we consume it, we're consuming it right now in this room and in our daily lives, and we've gotten used to it, and it's led to many of our advances in prosperity. Other parts of the world want the same thing. If they just had 50% of that, okay, you would have to increase global energy production by at least 50 or 60%. How are you going to do that simply on renewables? You can't. So for the foreseeable future, the world is going to be using hydrocarbons, oil and natural gas. And the question becomes, who is going to control that? Who is going to supply that to the world? Because the less we supply of it, the more the OPEC countries will. In an industry, by the way, where the less of it you supply, the more money you make. Because of supply and demand. It's the reason why President Biden's had to reach into the strategic reserves. So I think there has to be some real balance in how we approach this, or we're going to wind up impoverishing our own economy. Meanwhile, China leads the world in coal-fired plant financing. They lead the world in excess refining capacity for petroleum. So yeah, they're doing the batteries and the solar, they're doing all that stuff, but they are building refining capacity for oil, and they are building coal-fired plants all over the planet, because countries that are developing are not going to walk away from that until they've reached our levels. And I think we need to acknowledge that. Our emissions are down, 33% since the 1970s? Today, 50% of the emissions come out of the Asia-Pacific region. And we need to acknowledge that is going to continue as long as those countries are developing, because they need affordable, reliable, and abundant energy resources.
Our world is cooking. It is caused by human activity and by the emissions we put into the atmosphere. Absolutely. China's emissions are growing faster than any other country in the world. And if you put in combination China, India, Russia, and their emissions from heavy industry, from transportation, from the development of their economies, it will swamp anything that we do. And so many ask, why restrain our industry and our economy at all in pursuit of this future? Well, frankly, because I would argue we don't have a choice. The models for how much we will end up spending, for how disastrous and destructive it will be if we cannot collectively come up with a path forward, it swamps everything else. The number of billion-dollar disasters per year have increased year after year after year, and they will outstrip our capacity to sustain them or pay for them here in the United States. So how do we deal with this? Through a market mechanism that puts a price on emissions-intensive exports, that protects American manufacturing, that says if you're making steel or cement or glass or aluminum in the United States and you are doing it in a clean way, you already are because you're already complying with U.S. regulations. We shouldn't let dirty, cheap Chinese, Russian, Indian steel, cement, glass into the United States market without a tariff. I'm pushing for a border carbon adjustment, a border tariff on those emissions-intensive products. And my hope is that, as Chancellor Scholz proposed 2 years ago at the G7, we will end up in a common approach between the EU, UK, US, Canada, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and these open societies that share climate ambition will then say to the Chinese, if you want to sell into our markets, you have to meet our standards for emissions. That and that alone will change the Chinese trajectory in terms of their industry. Otherwise, nice speeches at global conferences, I am skeptical, will make a lasting difference. A market economy and a market mechanism, that can change the world.
Well, I think nation states are going to act in their national interest. And so we just saw it now, right? When Russian oil was taken off the marketplace, the amount of nations that gravitated to burning coal because it was cheaper grew exponentially. The truth of the matter is these are developing countries who want their piece of prosperity. In order to have prosperity, they need to be able to generate energy. Now, maybe 100 years from now, maybe 50 years from now, it will be cheaper to generate it from some other source other than those hydrocarbons, but not today and not for the foreseeable future. So hydrocarbons are going to be a part of the matrix. And that's true for our domestic, economy. To tell people, in Florida, our largest utility company has walked away from coal and is doing extensive natural gas and has nuclear energy as well. And prices have been stable and they've been able to retain that. But that took time to build up to that point, and they still have as their backbone a hydrocarbon, natural gas. The truth of the matter is that the notion or the idea that we're going to, at the utility sector, going to be able to replace hydrocarbons with solar and wind, it's just, the numbers just aren't there. It's not real. And it will have a dramatic impact on our economy. It will have a dramatic impact on the cost of living in this country. And other nations are not going to go along because they need to develop their economies. They need to provide prosperity for their people. And you cannot do that today or for the foreseeable future with the existing technologies, no matter what example we think we're setting.
We can and we should innovate our way forward through this. I'm not sure if the senator's debating now with me or with someone who's not on the stage, but I support nuclear. I support natural gas because it has brought down emissions in the last decade by more than 30%, switching from coal to natural gas and relying on cleaner and cleaner combustion of natural gas and nuclear as we grow the percentage of our portfolio that is geothermal and hydro and wind and solar is a long-term sustainable path. We may differ on how urgent this is. I think the science is clear, and I think the numbers are strong. And the criticism that we can't make a difference as long as the Chinese and Indians and other developing economies continue to grow their coal-fired power plants and their emissions, I agree. That is a critical concern. Anyone of my party who wants to persuade the other party and our public that we have a path forward needs a market mechanism. That's why I put one forward.
Senator Rubio, Senator Coons answered this, and I'm just curious where you come down on the idea that, you know, we're in the midst of the hottest year expected, according to forecasters and scientists, ever recorded in the realm of records kept. What's causing these extreme temperatures?
Yeah, at the end of the day, those are measurables, right? Like the sea level rise, it's higher than it used to be. You can measure that and you can project where it's going to be. The same with the temperature events. Now, you can read all kinds of things. I get it, the consensus of the scientists. Others will show you these graphs if you go out 1,000 years, 500 years, 300 years. You know, in the 1930s was a pretty hot period. We had a Dust Bowl, we had a bunch of wildfires. But my point on that is, it's okay if we think that we want to address that by moving towards new energy sources that produce less carbon emissions. That's fine, as long as it doesn't devastate our economy. And I just don't want to pretend. And I'm not accusing the senator of being one of the ones that pretend. He's quite, reasonable in his approach on it, I think, for the most part, as you've seen here tonight. You know, he says, am I debating somebody else? Maybe I wish I had a different debate partner on this topic for this one. But the truth of the matter is we can't fall under the illusion, and I'm not claiming he's making this claim, but under the illusion that somehow for the foreseeable future, we are going to be able to provide both industry and individual Americans the reliable and affordable energy through alternatives that we can today provide through hydrocarbons. We can't, and we won't be able to. At a minimum, natural gas, which we have abundant supplies of, need to be a key part of that for 50 years, 25 years, however long that transition takes. Now, none of us here can say what innovations will come along over the next 25 or 30 years that will reduce the price point at some of this, that perhaps will make other technologies more efficient. And if those come on, perfect, especially if we dominate them from an American standpoint. But we're not there today, and we're not there for the foreseeable future. And I do think that this is an issue where the costs and the benefits, the real-life costs, have to come into play. And you can ask Europe what happens when you don't make those cost-benefit analysis in their climate decisions. It has an impact that roils society, that undermines their economy, and in the case of the Ukrainian invasion, forced them to go back to the drawing board and reconsider where they were going to get their natural gas from.
Let me ask the question more directly. What's causing climate change?
Well, again, these scientists have published all these reports that say that since the industrial era, temperatures have risen. I believe that needs to be compared with a much broader time frame and record. There have been instances. I'll give you an example. Okay, this is not a scientific analysis. This is a real-world analysis. My backyard is full of coral rock. You can't dig 3 inches without hitting coral rock. That's why I don't dig in my yard anymore, because you'll break yourself. That means at some point in history, my backyard, my home, was underwater. Now, I don't want it to get back to that. At a minimum, I want it to stop like at my neighbor's house that I'm waterfront, My property value goes up. But all kidding aside, the climate's always changing, and it's always adjusting. The point is to ascribe and say, okay, 80% of what's happening is a result of humanity, and therefore we must wipe out our economy, we must impoverish ourselves by relying on unreliable sources of energy that are also costlier, I think is economic suicide. Because these other nations are not going to do it. It sounds a lot like if China, once they get rich, they'll become just like us. Once they get rich, they'll become cleaner. We're counting on that. We're making a big mistake like the mistakes we made 30 years ago. I don't think we should make that decision, no matter how many UN reports they put out, because we're not a planet. We're a country. And these other emitters continue to emit in ways that dwarf, by the senator's own admission, anything we could possibly cut. Now, that doesn't mean we stand in the way of innovation on these industries or on these energy sources. But we can't pretend that any time in the foreseeable future they will replace what we've become accustomed to.
You have a rebuttal? Otherwise,
human activity is causing our climate to warm, and it's causing devastating changes in our climate. Where animals live, where plants grow and thrive, where people can survive, is changing and changing rapidly. Two different mountains I visited in my lifetime, Kilimanjaro and the mountains of central Montana, had glaciers 30 years ago. I've been back to both, and the glaciers are almost completely gone. It's not my backyard, but it's another example I'll offer of just an observation. As someone who trained as a scientist, as a chemist, I've believed now for decades that there is compelling scientific evidence that the emissions we are putting into the atmosphere, methane and carbon dioxide and others, are changing the chemistry of our atmosphere and our future as a planet. We are a country, but we're also citizens of this planet. And if the planet becomes unlivable, uninhabitable, the millions who will migrate to flee those challenges and impacts for us will be unavoidable. We have to come up with a strategy to bring our two topics together to find a way to drive China towards reducing its emissions in time that we also can innovate and reduce our emissions before it is too late. I think we have a difference of opinion about the urgency of that timeline, but I'll close with this. I worked in an innovative company in the private sector. I have optimism that we can win the competition to be the dominant technology country of this century as we transition globally to a cleaner energy economy. That's part of why I supported the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act. I was as excited about the science part as I was about the CHIPS part, because we both have kids, 3 and 4, and I worry about the future of this planet, and so do my kids.
Well, I worry about the future of the planet too, except I would add this. Yes, he adds about climate change is going to lead to all of these disruptions around the world. You know what else is going to lead to a bunch of disruptions? The inability of governments to provide economic prosperity and a way forward for their people. That's what's happened in Haiti. That's what's happening in much of Latin America and in the places where we see migration. They can't provide for their families. And so if you cannot provide the sort of abundant and affordable energy sources necessary to provide that, you're also going to have civil wars and mass migrations and things of this nature. So those things need to be balanced when we make these decisions. As far as human activity is concerned, the United States has already reduced its emissions by 33% since the 1970s. I think advances in technology and changes that people are adopting will continue to move us in the right direction. What I don't think we need to do is suddenly overreach and say, well, we're going to do all these things no matter what impact they have on our economy. Again, on this point, I'm not saying that's what Senator Coons is asking for, because I don't want to besmirch anybody else who's on the stage, but not everybody thinks there should be any balance whatsoever with regard to this issue. I think there needs to be. Because the result, and the one thing I think we would both agree on is, irrespective of whatever law we pass or whatever incentives we create, this is the trend line for the foreseeable future, and we need to mitigate against the impacts that these are having. Where people can build, what they can build, how do we fortify against it? Mitigation is going to be necessary no matter what, and I, for one, have long been supportive of that.
I got a question for both of you that sets aside energy policy, concerns about climate change. I'm going to take you both home, because Senator Coons alluded to this. You both come from low-lying coastal states. If a constituent comes up to either of you and says, hey, I'm thinking of buying some property along the coast. You're not real estate agents, you're not investment bankers, but you are leaders and subject matter experts.
And we stayed at Holiday Inn Express.
And you stayed if they asked you, should I buy coastal property right now, what would you tell them?
I'd tell them to take a hard look at the FEMA flooding maps and how inaccurate they have proven to be. So when I was county executive, we were both in local government, state government, county government. In 4 years, we had a 100-year flood, a 500-year flood, and a 100-year flood in my county. Clearly, this was happening more often than every 100 years. And so where we issue insurance, where we predict flooding is clearly off. I would urge folks to buy on higher ground farther back, and to think about not buying right on the coastal waterfront. I'd also encourage them to look at the history of Delaware's coastline, which has moved west over the last century. So I do think sea level rise is a real thing. I do think catastrophic events in our climate are pushing where we can inhabit, and I think federal and state policy needs to respond to that. We are ensuring the reconstruction of homes in places that are not long-term sustainable. So I'd tell them, word of caution, maybe you want to buy on higher ground.
This is actually a real-life scenario on a daily basis, but it goes back 80 to 100 years. South Florida, if you know Miami, anything west of 27th, 37th Avenue was the Everglades. That's what it was forever. And then people decided, we're going to go in, we're going to drain them with a bunch of canals, which had a huge impact on the Everglades and the system of that ecosystem. And we're going to fill it in with sand, including Miami Beach, which is not a real island. It's a rock formation they put sand on, and we're going to build stuff here. And, that's 60, 50, 60, 70 years later, but that's nothing in the history of the Earth. And so suddenly the Earth decides, well, you know what? I mean, this is still a swamp, no matter how much sand you put on it or how much you build. And that's something that I think requires a level of acceptance and humility. Now, if you want to buy oceanfront property, you need to recognize that, number one. And number two, you probably need to build something different than what's there now. Higher, fortified against the wind for certain, but maybe against water. And in some places, you may not be able to. There may be some places where you simply cannot protect it against floodwaters. And I do think that there is a conversation to be had and a very serious look to be made at once you've rebuilt the place 3 times, as has happened in some parts of the country. I think it's telling you that these are areas that are very impossible to insure and difficult to secure. But we've built some pretty expensive real estate in those parts, and reality tells us that we're going to have to mitigate against it as best we can. But I think it would depend on where people are looking to build. If it's a place that has historic, that the geology would sustain something that you could build that's stronger or protected against water, that'd be fine. But there's some areas you simply will not be able to rebuild that.
Well, having seen your neighborhood in Little Havana, if yours becomes coastal property, we're in real trouble.
Yes.
But thank you both for engaging on that one. I actually didn't think you'd give specific answers, so I appreciate that you did. We're going to move on to the sort of grab bag portion of the evening and talk a little bit about bipartisanship, because this is, after all, hosted by the Bipartisan Policy Center, and about the Senate, because this is, after all, the Senate project. Let me start with this. Senator Coons, why are you here tonight?
Because Franz Werfmannsdobler, who works for the Bipartisan Policy Center, recruited me. I'm here because I believe, as we heard at the outset from our 2 friends, the former senators, that bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. And I'm here because of that exchange with one of our framers, one of our founders, Benjamin Franklin. A republic, madam, if you can keep it. In the tumult of the last couple of years, I've moved from confidence about the future of our democracy to grave concern. We are fraying. We've seen in our 13 years in the Senate together how frequently we are voting, how frequently we have regular order, how frequently we are meaningfully legislating. Our Senate floor is empty and silent most of the time. And so I'm here because I was invited to take the stage with someone who's served as long as I have and with whom I've legislated across the arc of our 13 years. I just turned 60 on last Saturday. And I'm starting to ask myself, how much more can I do? How much of an impact can I have? And I'm confident that without this work, without reigniting the spirit of Hatch and Kennedy, we really are at risk of losing this most sacred project of our republic.
Senator Rubio?
Well, I'm here primarily to convince Chris Coons to agree with me on everything, but apparently that has not worked. But all kidding aside, I would say a couple things. First of all, I think one of the most important things is to understand what bipartisan means. Bipartisan doesn't mean you agree even on the issues, specifically on how to solve them. It means you agree that the process matters to solving these problems. You have to have a process in which they're solved. And the lack of that, especially in this day and age, is actually hurting the country. Now, I think there are some real challenges our nation is facing, and they're not just in politics. In many ways, our politics is a mirror that reflects our culture and our society. And American politics is polarized because America, in many respects, is polarized. And what we're trying to do in America has always been hard. We are as diverse a society and culture as there's ever existed on the planet, and yet somehow we have to figure out a way out of all these different people with all these different ideas to build one nation. And that's hard. Other places may have it easier in that regard. We also have the First Amendment. We also have a democratic process in which people can express themselves and choose their leaders. And we have a country in which California and Mississippi are very different, which is one of the wisdoms behind federalism. But it's having a real impact on us in the world. Because other countries and leaders watch our news, and they watch these reports, and they think this nation is falling apart. They think we are on the verge of a civil war. They think we are about to implode from within, and it invites adventurism, and that's dangerous. And so I think it's important, anytime we have an opportunity, whether it's on this stage or on the floor of the Senate, to show that there are some principles that still govern us and in how we behave, because the lack of that invites our adversaries to do things that act against us. I would add one more point, which is really important in all of these meetings. We have to understand that with all this talk of bipartisanship, and I know I'm not against it, and I know it's happening in this forum, which are a lot of people committed to it, there are a lot of people in this country that are really angry at the political system for a lot of different reasons. They feel like they've been left behind. They feel like they've been ignored. They feel like all the economic benefit have gone to people in certain industries and certain parts of the country at their expense. And it's manifesting itself in a way that I think is creating an extraordinary realignment in our politics in ways that are unpredictable. And that's messy, and it's loud, and it's happening in an era in which polarization is encouraged. Senator Coons will tell you this. I think he'll agree with what I'm about to say. If you want to get famous in politics today, say outrageous, nasty things. You may never pass a bill, you may never make a difference, but you will get on television and the whole country will know what your name is. And I think it's important to understand that today we live in a media culture that rewards and encourages that kind of behavior because it draws more clicks, it draws more viewers. We are incentivizing that behavior. And I get it, 24-hour news has to make money on news. And conflict and outrage generates ratings. And bipartisanship and working together on things does not. But it'll also destroy our country. When the level of polarization paralyzes you and makes you incapable of confronting serious challenges, then you've got a big, big problem. It's not the nastiness that's the problem ultimately. It's the inability to act because of it that endangers our future. So I think, is that a good explanation for why I'm here? All right.
Works for me. Although let the record reflect, I don't work for one of those conflict-focused channels. Let me ask you a more practical question about how the Senate works and how you guys spend your time in Washington. And this may be an uncomfortable and maybe it's a naive question, but I'll ask it anyway. Senator Rubio, when was the last time you went to dinner one-on-one with a Democrat?
One-on-one? Probably 2.5 years ago. But he lost his election. No, I'm kidding. And because of having dinner with me. No, I probably 2.5 years ago. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not a night person to begin with. Breakfast is a better question.
Okay. When was the last time you went to breakfast with a member of the other party?
I'd have to look, probably 8 months ago. But here's what people have to understand. Senators, first of all, there's only 100 of us, so everybody knows everybody. Second of all, today you're fighting about something, but next week that person may be on your side on the same issue. You know, I know people think this is, you know, that we walk by in the hallways and spit on each other and call each other names, but you know these people, and you fought with them on 10 things, and you've had to work on 1 or 2. So I mean, maybe you have a different perception, but generally speaking, the most coveted thing for any bill you file is, can I get a co-sponsor from the other party? Yep. It's a highly coveted thing. You want, who can I find from the other party to make it bipartisan? That's still very coveted. What is more problematic is believe it or not, bipartisan bills that make sense are the hardest things to pass these days because they don't move the needle politically, because they don't get the attention maybe they deserve, because if it's not controversial, people figure it must not be that important. I think that's become a real challenge in that regard. My experience, by and large, is that individual members, for the most part, actually have good working relationships. There are always exceptions to people that may not like each other for this reason or that reason. But generally speaking, I think it's pretty productive. And that way, getting the results is the problem. And then you still got to pass it through the other chamber.
Right. Senator Coons, have you done anything socially with any of the 8 Republican senators who voted against certifying the 2020 presidential election? Since they did so.
I have, and it's funny you should mention that specific question. I'm a regular participant in the weekly bipartisan prayer breakfast.
Which is why I didn't ask you about breakfast.
Yes. So I have breakfast.
The breakfast I was at, by the way.
Was it?
No, it was not. It was not the one I was at. No.
And on the matter of lunch, I'm just going to briefly mention a dear friend of ours, Senator Johnny Isakson, for a decade hosted a bipartisan barbecue lunch where he had a whole crew drive up from Georgia and provide barbecue. And Johnny would stand up and say, this is simple. Barbecue brings people together. I'm not going to give a long speech. Find a member of the other party you don't know well and haven't sat with and sit with them. Let's eat. And Senator Blunt and I continued that tradition. And this Thursday, that's happening again. So, Marco, please come.
Wait,
and
I got to write that on my
Thursday
schedule.
lunch.
I didn't know it was this Thursday. I like barbecue.
And it's
we
great
have agreement on
barbecue.
But of those 8 senators
Of those 8 senators, the story I was about to tell was, so I was the speaker at the prayer breakfast 3-4 months ago. And as I was reflecting on a particular passage of Scripture, it became clear to me that it was really a challenge to me directly, because I was holding a deep grudge that I would not resolve against those who voted in the Senate. The January 6th was a fairly challenging, unsettling, gravely concerning day. And a number of the folks who, even after that, were unwilling to reconcile, I was refusing to speak to. And one of them was in the room. And so I stood up and spoke that morning about my own need for humility and for open-heartedness and for a willingness to be reconciled, even to people against whom I was holding a fairly profound grudge. And that senator and I have now introduced and passed a piece of legislation that actually goes back to the histories of our 2 states, both of which were segregated by expanding the Brown versus Board National Historic Site to include my state and his state. So I have not reconciled with all of them, but I have made some progress.
Fair enough. Senator Rubio, you alluded to this a little bit in that there's 100 of you, you know each other. You know that organizations like the one sponsoring this, you know that columnists in newspapers or commentators on the less angry television shows might pine for those days when you all lived in Washington, when you all hung out after work. Is that a naive way of looking at how Washington should operate now or can operate now?
In terms of?
In terms of finding bipartisan consensus and making sure the process works.
Well, look, I think the first thing is when people know each other, it's a lot harder to hate each other. You may disagree, but I mean, who among us doesn't have a member of our family, a coworker, someone, we are in an organization together, a prayer breakfast, but you have disagreements on things, but you know them holistically as a person. You don't just know who they voted for. You don't just know how they voted on the last bill, and you don't just know what bumper stickers they have on their car. You know them as a person, as a father, as a mother, as a neighbor, as someone who did you a favor, or vice versa. And I think that's always important. I think in the Senate that happens a little bit more. Our committees are smaller. You end up kind of working with people, and you have to make a point of seeking it. I don't know if we're ever going to get back to a time where everybody lived in Washington and vacationed on weekends for a lot of different reasons. I think that gets more difficult. But I don't think you necessarily need to have that in order to have that level of cooperation and the ability to work together and know each other holistically. In the end, you may not end up agreeing on 9 out of 10 things, but you will be able to work on some things that you have common interest on. And again, I go back to what I said, the most coveted thing in Washington, at least in the Senate, is a bipartisan co-sponsor on your bill. Everybody wants one because it makes your bill more attractive and likelier to pass. And I think it makes it easier to do that when you know that person personally. In my case, I mean, there was a time when Senator Cardin and I were passing so many bills together that people started mistaking us for one another. They thought they would call me Cardin and him Rubio. So, and that happens. And I think Senator Coons will tell you that as well. There are people that you end up creating those sorts of relationships because of the committees you're on, because of the interests of your state, or because of a particular interest you might have. And that includes traveling abroad, which is something I hope we'll be able to do more of in the years to come.
There is a subject that has earned a lot more attention in recent months because of who lives in the White House and because of some of the people both of you serve with. And I want to quote something one of your colleagues, Utah Republican Senator Mitt Romney, recently said. He called the U.S. Senate a, quote, club for old men. The average age in the Senate is 63 years old. You are both under average in that regard. Senator Coons, as you said, you just turned 60. Senator Rubio, you're 52. But in your view, Senator Coons, how old is too old to serve in the United States Senate?
I think it's less a matter of years than it is of capability, focus, and engagement. I actually had a debate on the Senate floor with a Republican colleague a decade ago about term limits. And there is a basic difference between structurally having an age limit or a term limit and saying we trust the electorate. This is what elections are for. The electorate should look at us and say, you seem to have lost a step, or I support this person and I think their seasoning, their experience, their relationships will make them a stronger legislator even into their 4th or 5th term, even into their 8th decade. Over the course of the 13 years we've served together, we've seen folks younger than us, who perhaps didn't succeed at the job, and much older than us, who passed landmark legislation together. So I think it is hard to say this is the age limit, 65 and there's mandatory retirement. But the question of engagement, acuity, capacity is one that is in front of us all the time. I look back at the last Congress, the last 2 years, and it is one of the most legislatively accomplished in decades. The bipartisan accomplishments of the last Congress stripped out and exceeded anything in the last 30 years. And I think in no small part that is a tribute to the seasoning and capabilities of some of the folks who serve in the Senate and our current president.
So you wouldn't put a number on it?
I wouldn't.
Senator Rubio?
Yeah, I agree that there's no number. I think it has to do with your capacity to do your job. You know, Chuck Grassley knows everything that's happening, remembers everything that's happened, and knows when you're on the wrong side of an issue that he cares about, and will let you know all about why you're wrong. And he's, and so I don't think that a number is an age-driven thing. I think it's more of a capacity-driven thing. I think there's one more thing that I would point to, simply beyond what some people have pointed to in the past, and that is, I do think there comes a time for all of us where you have to ask yourself, why are you still doing the job? And it takes a certain level of fire and passion to do it well and to do it for the right reasons. And whenever that moment comes that you no longer are excited about doing the job, or it becomes difficult to get excited about doing the job, or you feel like you're working towards some goal and achieving things, I think that's also a moment to reflect on why you're still there. And so I admire people that decide, I've done what I'm going to do, and now I'm going to move forward and move on and do something different, at whatever age they make that decision. And I think that's a big part of it. But I don't think you can put a number on an age on it per se, especially nowadays where we have people of significant age that are achieving extraordinary things. But it really has to do with your ability to do the job and do it with the same level of energy and intensity that your constituents in the country deserves.
I realize I'm asking this to senators who represent states with large retiree populations, so you're a little sensitive to this, but I appreciate the answer. I'm curious
many of whom are still voting well into their 90s. Okay, just to be clear.
That's why you have to be careful. There have been some proposals to potentially allow a state to appoint a temporary replacement if somebody's going to be out for a while, either for health or other reasons. Would either of you be supportive of either Delaware or Florida considering something like that?
Okay, I think that's a decision a state legislature should make. I think it depends on the state and its context and the reasons they'd be taking it up. There's as many different ways of filling vacancies as there are states.
Well, I think what you're talking about is a temporary.
Yeah.
Well, until the senator returns, like a leave of absence. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that sounds kind of weird. You know what I mean? Because there's a real inconsistency there. But the new person that's appointed, how they're going to file any bills? We don't know when the other guy's coming back. And then what happens to the bills you filed, the work you did. Honestly, in some of these cases, I would hope that people who love these people or people who are close to these people would encourage them at some point that, maybe it's time for a transition. And generally, people get that right, for the most part. But none of us controls. One day you're doing great with health, and the next day, something could happen in your lives, and that change that dynamic. I heard this morning about a member of the House who will not be running for re-election because of a diagnosis. And I think it's made a very difficult but poignant decision in that regard. And so it's a tough one, because, but I don't know about that proposal. I actually have not heard it. Did you make that one up yourself?
No,
right
I did
now?
not.
Oh, okay.
No. Again, I'm from one of those fact-based channels. Real quick, as we wrap up, two unique questions to each of you. Senator Rubio, you said you're not picking sides in the Republican presidential race. What is it, though, that you might like about the Floridians who are running for the Republican nomination?
Everybody's moved to Florida, so I got to go through my brain now and see how many people are.
We've got your city governor and the former president.
Look, just to be frank, when President Trump was president, there were a lot of good public policy that I was able to get achieved. The child tax credit expansion wasn't as high as I wanted it to be, but it was a real expansion, and it happened as part of tax reform. I think about some of the policies we adopted in the Western Hemisphere we had significant influence on. When we had natural disasters in Florida, it was very responsive. And I live in a state where I think Governor DeSantis has done a good job as governor. Generally, people don't flock to and move to a state that's poorly managed and chaotic. And that's not what Florida is because of the leadership he's put forward. So, and then there are other people. Tim Scott's one of my closest friends in the U.S. Senate, someone who supported me when I ran for president. I think he has a strong message. Ambassador Haley supported me as well, and I think she did a great job at the UN. I'm not leaving anyone out on purpose. I'm just saying that all these people, I think, provide really strong choices, and we'll see how it all plays out. I think, frankly, one of the reasons why I don't think it matters what senators think about primaries is very few Americans are waiting for their senator to tell them who to vote for when it comes to president. And these will be highly watched and followed races, and Republican voters will choose a nominee, and we'll go from there.
Senator Coons, if President Biden wins another term and Secretary of State Antony Blinken opts to leave, what qualities should the next Secretary of State possess?
Should be from the same state as the president, at least.
Speaking on behalf of three gentlemen of great stature, he should stand at least 6 feet tall and have a full head of hair. Look, I have great respect for Secretary Blinken and for the national security and foreign policy team the president has put together, and he's entitled to pick, obviously whoever he wants. I asked for his guidance on how I could best contribute to this administration, and his pointed input was stay in the Senate and craft bipartisan bills. That's the task I've put myself to, and if you look at the last 2 years, I think the outcome's been very positive, not because of me, but because of a dozen on both sides. I was saddened, frankly, to read the Atlantic piece on Mitt Romney and why he is retiring from the Senate, and it is my hope that whoever is the next president, and I have a strong favorite, our current president, that he will be served by a cabinet that has the understanding and the knowledge of how to move legislation in the Congress. We are grinding down into an inability to confirm ambassadors, to confirm judges, to pass legislation. And whether in the cabinet, at home in Delaware, or in the Senate, it's my hope that we will have a next Congress and a next administration that is committed to our role in the world, to the rule of law, to human rights as being a core part of our national interests and fundamental values, and to democracy. Because at the end of the day, this is the only country in human history committed to liberty and justice. And I don't want to see this experiment end.
But if he calls and says...
I'll consider it seriously.
Okay, fair enough. There we go.
I just want to leave something very clear. If he offers it to me, I too will not serve under President Biden.
I was going to ask you if you'd vote for him, but I won't ask you that hypothetical. If he's nominated to never win. Anyway, it's time for closing arguments. Senator Rubio, you get to go first.
Look, I appreciate you hosting this, and I think this is really important. I do believe the country's in the middle, as I said earlier, in the middle of a real political realignment that I think challenges both political parties to sort of find. I actually think that at the end of the day, our political process is much more polarized than maybe everyday people are from all walks of life. But I think it's an important moment to understand that we're never going to go back to the past. You can't go back to the past. The future is inevitable. But we have to shape a future that recognizes some key, core, and important things. The first is that nationhood matters. That at the end of the day, our job, more than anything else, before anything else, is to do what's in the best interest of America. That doesn't mean at the expense of the world. But I actually think a good and a strong America is good for the world. And that includes having an economy that, yes, expects able-bodied people to work, but also an economy that makes sure it's producing stable and dignified and reliable work for people, that they can at least sustain a family and contribute to community and things that are critical to the future of our country. We're being tested on the international stage. And we're not just being tested in our foreign policy. We're not just being tested in our military projections and spending. We're also being tested in how we perform and behave here at home. Because people watch what's happening in America, whether it was January 6th or the debates that happen every day in our politics, and it influences our adversaries' views of America. Senator Coons said this earlier, and I would like to echo it. Our adversaries, particularly China, aggressively go around the world telling people America is a hollowed-out nation in decline. And all they have to just look at their political process, how messy it is, how dysfunctional it is. They can't even fund the government and keep it open. How can you rely on them to come to your defense? And so I think we have to be cognizant of that as we work through our disagreements, which are real. And at the same time, be cognizant that there are people out there that are frustrated, that feel disconnected, abandoned, and disenfranchised from those who have been in power. And we have to recognize that that's real, and we have to give it a voice. And I hope we can build a governing consensus, because we had one in this country. Even during the Cold War, we had one. We had a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, but there was a governing consensus that the Soviet Union and Marxism on a global scale needed to be defeated. I think we have a similar challenge now, and it's going to take a lot of work in a difficult environment pull that together. And I appreciate the chance tonight to at least help model how some of those conversations would go. Maybe not perfectly, but I hope it's just one more example of the kinds of things I think we can hopefully achieve together if we give it a shot.
Senator Coons.
Let me tell you a quick story about 3 different women and the roles they play in this evening. When we were first elected and came to Washington, we were from different backgrounds, different states, didn't know each other, didn't know much about each other. Marco was a high-profile national figure that had been catapulted to election. I had defeated someone who went on TV and said she wasn't a witch. So I was seen perhaps as more the accidental senator and Marco as the rising star. But within our first week here, one person, Adrienne Arsht, who graduated from the same high school I did and was a native Delawarean, and who was a business leader and a doyen of the arts in Miami, texted both of us and said, you should get to know that other guy. And I think we both literally went, him? And she texted us and pushed us until we sat down and started talking together and produced that first bill. We all need others outside our immediate circle and concerns, the day-to-day things that distract us, to push us together. And I see the hand of Providence in the fact that Adrienne Arsht just happened to have both our cell phones and was able to get inside our lives and our circles. I have a dear departed grandmother who was very conservative and who resented every dime of taxes she ever paid. And who said to me once early in my career, don't ever forget your pay stub says legislator. I want to know that you're doing it. And every time you cash that paycheck, don't you forget that you're paid by the taxpayers to do that job. And it's my hope that out of this discussion tonight, we will go back to legislating together. Marco and I, Senator Rubio and I have legislated in support of Israel and its security, in advancing human rights, in challenging Wagner and China's human rights violations, in advancing innovation and investment in science and technology, and I hope we'll do more. I went to the National Constitution Center late in 2017 when they were giving the Liberty Medal to the late John McCain. And it was my friend Joe Biden, then Vice President, who introduced him. He spoke longer than Senator McCain in introducing him. And Senator McCain delivered a remarkable speech. This was late in his life, and he knew the end was coming. And if you haven't watched it, go watch it. It's a love letter to America. And it was a striking night, and I went home and said to my wife, Annie, how tragic that this incredible generation of senators is passing. So clear tonight on that stage that they knew each other. They knew each other's spouses. They knew each other's kids. They'd traveled together. They'd stayed in each other's homes. They disagreed on a lot of important things, but they trusted each other, and each knew the other was a patriot committed to our nation. And my wife, as she so often does, wouldn't let me just sort of wallow in that moment. She said, that's your job, Buster. I said, excuse me? And she said, go find Republican friends and partners or make new friends and partners. Invite them to Delaware, go to their homes in their states, sit with them, legislate with them, work with them so that somehow on some stage, 10 or 20 years from now, some other young Americans might look at the two of you and say, how inspiring to have two such different senators so willing to legislate together. That's why I'm here tonight. Democracy is a verb, and it has to be an active verb, and it only remains a democracy if we do it together. Thank you.
Our thanks to Senator Coons and Senator Rubio. It's a Monday night in Washington after they held a 5:30 vote. They could have been doing a lot of other things tonight.
Like watching football.
Like
right?
watching football. Yes, we'll get you there. Hopefully we provided a little bit of that nudge that Senator Coons talked about, and that's why I know this reporter at least was eager to participate tonight. So thank you both for doing it, and to your staffs for making the time. Our thanks as well to the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, the Orrin G. Hatch Foundation, and yes, this American University graduate will thank the George Washington University for hosting us here tonight. I'm Ed O'Keefe of CBS News. Thanks for watching. Good night.